emphasis on modeling. Underlying mechanisms and individual differences. John T. Cacioppo, Bert N. Buccino, Stephen L. Price, Mary A. Snyder-Smith, Gregory Smith, Gary G. Bergson, Ohio State University. Peter J. Lang, University of Florida. Two important questions bearing on personality processes and individual differences are how do facial expressiveness and sympathetic activation vary as a function of the intensity of an emotional stimulus, and what is the functional mechanism underlying facial expressiveness and sympathetic activation in emotion. A formulation is proposed that is based on two propositions. A. All strong emotions result in some degree of activation of the organism, i.e., principle of stimulus dynamism, and B. There are individual differences in the gain, amplification, operating on the facial expressive and sympathetic response channels, i.e., principle of individual response uniqueness. This formulation organizes much of the existing data on internalizers and externalizers and yields novel predictions regarding the subpopulation labeled as generalizers. Emotion is one of the most complex phenomena known to psychology. It is complex because it involves so much of the organism at so many levels of integration. Perhaps therein lies the uniqueness, and possibly the major significance, of emotion. Lindsley, 1951, p. 473. Human emotion represents a broad class of phenomena involving the stimulation of feelings and cognitions, e.g., memorize and appraisal, visceral, humoral, and immunological reactions, gestures, vocalizations, and expressive displays, postural orientations and overt behaviors, or varying combinations of these. Human emotions emerge as a product of evolutionary forces acting on variability within a social species and are implemented in what is in part an archaic brain. Emotions have been further characterized as A. Being evoked by biologically relevant stimuli and by associated internal or external events. B. Mobilizing limited attentional and cognitive resources in an attempt to facilitate present or future coping. And C. Modulate ing internalized and externalized actions that foster a generally adaptive coping response, e.g., Izzard, 1977, Plutchik and Kellerman, 1980. Although biological, cognitive, social, and developmental. This research is based on work supported by National Science Found Data Grant BNS 881855/8940915 and a National Science Foundation Fellowship. We thank Ross Buck, Bernard T. Engel, Elaine Hatfield, Karen S. Quigley, and Louis G. Tassinari for their comments on an earlier draft of this article. Correspondence concerning this article should be addressed to John T. Cacioppo, Department of Psychology, Ohio State University, 1885, Neal Avenue, Columbus, Ohio, 43210-1222. Electronic mail may be sent to Cacioppo. l@osu.edu. Factors determine human emotions, e.g., Izzard and Malatesta, 1987, Lazarus, 1966. Of particular interest here is the observation that social and environmental factors may exert different tile pressure on component processes in emotion. Externalized processes such as vocalizations, facial expressions, and overt actions are more obviously subject to the forces of socialization and instrumental conditioning than are the internalized processes of visceral, humoral, and immunological responses. If individual differences in the mechanism underlying internalized and externalized components of emotional response are clarified, an understanding of emotion, and the means by which social and developmental factors influence emotion, can be advanced. Furthermore, how individuals express emotion has important implications for physical well-being, but the mechanisms underlying this relationship are not yet well understood. Therefore, modeling the functional mechanism on journeying internalized and externalized components of emo. Tidal response may be of some general interest to personality and social psychologists. The corpus of research that bears on internalized and externalized processes in emotion is as massive as the literature on emotion itself. We therefore have limited our review to research on individual differences in sympathetic activation, as indexed primarily by skin conductance, and facial expressiveness, as indexed by observer ratings, to intense emotional stimuli. We begin by briefly reviewing the two major theoretical approaches to emotion that have addressed some of the visceral response channels, psychophysiological arousal theory and emotinal discharge theory. Subsequently, we draw on Lacey and Lacey's 1958 seminal work on individual differences in physiological functioning to propose an alternative mechanism that provides a simple account for much of the extant data. Our 110. Patterns 111. Emphasis throughout this article is on the functional properties of aggregate excitatory neural mechanisms rather than on neurophysiological implementation. Point 1. Emotional arousal versus emotional discharge, general or reciprocal activation of facial expressiveness and sympathetic response. Psychophysiological arousal theory. The notion of general arousal has been central to analyses of emotion for more than a half century, e.g., Cannon, 1927, Mandler, 1975, Schachter and Singer, 1962, and the intensity of physiological and behavioral reactions remains an important dimension in analyses of emotion, e.g., see Greenwald, Cook, and Lang, 1989. Measures of emotional arousal have included psychophysiological assessments, performance on drive-sensitive tasks, self-reports, misattributions of bodily sensations, and reflex modulation assessments. See reviews by Cacioppo, Petty, and Tassinari, 1989, Lang, Bradley, and Cuthbert, 1990. These various response measures were thought to be affected similarly by an underlying arousal mechanism, whereas differences among these measures were thought to reflect measurement error or influences that were irrelevant to the analysis of psychological processes. The groundwork for psychophysiological arousal theory can be traced to the important studies of Gaskell, 1916, and Lang, Lay, 1921, and the following principles are now standard dogma in introductory psychology textbooks. A. The autonomic control of the heart, smooth muscles, and glands is divisible into the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. B. Preganglionic sympathetic fibers exit from the central nervous system in the thoracolumbar regions and generally synapse in a chain of interconnected ganglia lying along the spinal cord. C. Relatively long postganglionic sympathetic fibers innervate the effector, where their catabolic, energetic actions are typically mediated directly by the postganglionic release of norepinephrine and indirectly through adrenal medullary catecholamines. D. Preganglionic parasympathetic fibers exit the central nervous system at brainstem and sacral cord levels and generally synapse in discrete ganglia located on or near the effector. And E. Relatively short postganglionic parasympathetic fibers innervate the effector, where their anabolic, energy-conserving, AC tines are mediated by the neurotransmitter acetylcholine through muscarinic receptors that are not activated by blood-borne catecholamines. Cannon, 1929, advanced the hypothesis that there was a diffuse, non-specific sympathetic outflow through the interconnections in the sympathetic ganglia during emergency states, and that this sympathetic discharge was anti-graded with expressive/behavioral states, the so-called fight-or-flight reaction. Cannon's view was consistent with the NRV-releasing role ascribed to the sympathetic nervous system in autonomic regulation and with subsequent research on brainstem and limbic structures that suggested an integration of autonomic, electrocortical, and somatic/behavioral states, e.g., Lindsley, 1952, Maruzzi and McGowan, 1949, Ranson, 1934. Thus, a foundation was laid for a broad class of theories in which autonomic, Cannon, 1929, somatic, Malmo, 1957. 1959, and electrocortical, Lindsley, 1952, 1957, systems are activated and proprioception is intensified, Mandler, 1975, Schachter and Singer, 1962, as bodily resources are mobilized in intense emotional or motivational states. Distinctions exist among arousal theories, but these differences typically concern the neurophysiological implementation of the arousal mechanism rather than the functional properties of the arousal mechanism or its implications for somatovisceral activation in emotion. The functional features of arousal theory were derived in large part from drive theory, wherein variations in behavior were described in terms of the direction and intensity of behavior, e.g., Hull, 1943. In Duffy's arousal theory, 1957-1962, behavioral organization and performance were posited to vary with effective intensity in an inverse-shaped function. Effective intensity, however, was posited to manifest in a straightforward fashion as general. Physiological arousal, observable in internalized responses, e.g., skin conductance and electroencephalogram, and in externalized responses, E.G., muscle tension and expressiveness. Duffy, 1957, and Malmo, 1957, also explicitly addressed the role of individual differences. Both observed what appeared to be reliable individual differences in the intensity of physiological response shown in particular stimulus situations. Duffy and Malmo, therefore, considered these differential response tendencies to be characteristics of the individuals. Furthermore, because individuals were conceived of as varying along a dimension of general arousal, both internalized, e.g., sympathetic, and externalized, e.g., expressive, responses were thought to be activated similarly within individuals. To summarize thus far, arousal theory posits a common underlying excitatory mechanism that acts on all effectors to rally bodily resources during strong emotional states. Sympathetic activation and expressive tendency are expected to co-vary closely within individuals because of the putative operation of this general arousal mechanism. The predicted effects of weak, SI, moderate, S2, and strong, S3, levels of provocation are displayed in the top panel of Figure 1. Occasional exceptions to this prediction are expected, as when overt responses are masked or suppressed. Thus, an uncoupling between sympathetic and overt expressive response could occur when people freeze in fear, The muscular tension may be quite high, or when they deliberately mask or suppress strong feelings toward a stimulus. This uncoupling of sympathetic and overt expressive responses occurs, according to arousal theory, because of the intervention of an overlaying set of inhibitory processes acting on specific somatic responses. The approach taken here is similar to that adopted by Dukley, 1962, and Hebb, 1955. Thus, theoretical mechanisms are represented in terms of general, i.e., aggregate neural, system input, operating characteristics, including nonlinearities, and output. The functional OPRAT-ING characteristics of excitatory neural systems can be implemented neurophysiologically in a variety of ways. Where details of neurophysiological implementation can constrain or inform what are the likely or unlikely operating characteristics of the mechanism's underlying behavior, and where measures of physiological response can provide data bearing on the predicted outputs of these theoretical mechanisms, they are used. 112 Cacioppo et al. I. U4O. 35 M poundo. X high. Low moderate high. Sympathetic nervous system. F. O. 0. AXUJ. Low moderate high. Sympathetic nervous system. Figure 1. Relationship between facial expressiveness and sympathetic activation as portrayed by arousal theory, top panel, and by emotional discharge theory, bottom panel. The dark lines in each panel depict the theoretical relationship between expressiveness and sympathetic activation at 3 levels of stimulus intensity, SI weak, S2 equals moderate, and S3 equals strong. The ovals convey the variability typically found in psychophysiological functions. Behavioral reactions tends to covary with intensity of the evocative stimulus, Kimball, 1990, Lindsley, 1952. The prediction of general and diffuse physiological activation has failed at Pyrite-Howell tests. Not only are weak within subject and between subjects correlations among psychophysiological measures commonly found, but directional fractionation, e.g., negative within subject correlations between heart rate and skin conductance, occurs during some tasks, e.g., Lacey, Kagan, Lacey, and Moss, 1963, C.F. Elliott, 1974. Dissociations are also evident between self-report and autonomic measures of activation, C.A. Ciappo, Tassinari, Stonebreaker, and Petty, 1987. Indeed, this is a central problem in the clinical assessment of anxiety and fear, Lang, 1968. Not only are verbal, behavioral, and autonomic systems frequently discordant, but they change desynchronously during therapy, C. Lang, 1978, Rackman and Hodgson, 1974. Similar dissociations have been reported between LF. Trocortical and autonomic measures of activation, e.g., Buck, 1976, and, what is more pertinent here, between facial expressiveness and sympathetic response, e.g., Jones, 1935, Seebuck, 1979. We turn next to a review of a formulation that has been offered as an account for the fractionation between facial expressiveness and sympathetic response. Emotional discharge theory. Emotional discharge theory, which can be traced to the D-Y-namic theories of Freud, e.g., Bonaparte, Freud, and Criss, 1954, and Alexander, 1950, posits an inverse relationship between the outward expression of an emotion and the inward autonomic response at any given level of emotional stimulation. Investigators have observed for more than 70 years that the greater the visible signs of emotion, the less the response of the galvanometer, Frito, 1920, page 66. However, Jones, 1935, was apparently one of the first to use the term internalizer to refer to a person who has little expressive tendency but large and frequent sympathetic, IDOC, electrodermal, discharges, and the term externalizer to refer to a person who has a high expressive tendency and infrequent and small sympathetic discharges. Jones, 1930, 1935, further suggested that the inhibition of overt responding caused increased sympathetic activation. Jones, 1930, 1935, 1950, 1960, and Notarius at his call. Leaves, Notarius and Levinson, 1979, Notarius, Wemple, Ingram. Ham, Burns, and Haller, 1982, have been major advocates of an emotional discharge mechanism governing expressive tendency and sympathetic activation in emotion. 2 Notarius et al. 1982, for instance, characterized emotional discharge as follows. Importantly, these inhibitory actions are not thought to modulate the operation of the arousal mechanism. C. Duffy, 1957. For instance, attempts to inhibit externalized responses, e.g., facial expressiveness, are not expected to alter sympathetic activation or emotional experience. Although the intensity of autonomic, electrocortical, and B. Tuba, 1979-1980, has also made important contributions to this area, but he focused more on the differing predictions made by emotinal discharge and the facial feedback hypothesis. Interested readers should consult Buck for an informed review of emotional discharge versus facial feedback hypotheses. Although compatible, our focus is on a different, more dispositional mechanism that may contribute ing to somatovisceral activation in emotion. Patterns 113. Emotion is viewed as a form of energy and as such must follow the basic dynamics of energy conservation. As a person becomes emotionally aroused, this arousal must be discharged either directly through expression or indirectly through internal pathways. When an emotional reaction is directly expressed through the facial musculature or other overt expressive channels, physiological reactivity is attenuated, page 400. The postulate regarding energy conservation implies a fundamental trade-off between expressive and sympathetic activa tie-in in emotion within subjects, a prediction illustrated in the bottom panel of Figure 1. Note that as the intensity of an emotinal stimulus increases, I.e., from SI to S3, the total energetic response also increases, as represented by the parallel lines in the bottom panel of Figure 1. This feature is shared by arousal theories, see Figure 1, top panel. In striking contrast to arousal theories, however, the bottom panel of Figure 1 further depicts the trade-off between sympathetic activation and facial expressiveness at any given level of emotional stimulation. Thus, sympathetic activation, internalized processes, and facial expressiveness, externalized processes, represent alternative response channels through which a given quantity of emotional energy can be discharged. Jones, 1930, 1935, 1950, 1960, also addressed the ontogeny of internalized and externalized processes in emotion. During the normal process of acculturation, Jones argued, overt emotional expression increasingly elicits social disapproval. These social sanctions increase the developing child's control of emotional behavior, with the result being a shift from somatic to visceral patterns of response. Jones, 1935, page 241. Normal development, therefore, was thought to be characterized by an inhibition of overt emotional expression, which in turn led to an increase in the use of internal avenues of affect discharge. Importantly, Jones continued to presuppose that if expressive reach tie-ins were blocked, the emotional energy would manifest as sympathetic activation. If expressive reactions were enhanced, a concomitant reduction in sympathetic activation would result. Thus, the relationship between facial expressiveness and sympathetic activation was thought to be governed, at least in a signified Kant subset of situations in individuals, e.g., internalizers and externalizers, by an emotional discharge mechanism. Point 3. Formulations embracing this emotional discharge mechanism can be found in clinical literature and manifest as prescriptions about the health-endangering effects of withholding emotions and the helpful effects of expressing emotions, e.g., Nemia and Signios, 1970, Notarius and Levinson, 1979, Rappaport, 1953. See also, Buck, 1976, pages 265 to 266. Point 4. In an important critique of arousal theory, Fowles, 1980, posited that heart rate is an index of Graves, 1972-1975, behavioral activation system. Whereas skin conductance is a measure of the behavioral inhibition system, BIS. In Fowles' model, if an emotional stimulus activated the BIS, expressiveness could be attenuated while skin conductance activity was simultaneously enhanced. Interestingly, the early empirical evidence only suggested the operation of an underlying discharge mechanism. Landis, 1932, for instance, observed that several subjects, compared to the group average, were relatively expressive of fear, anger, or pain, but were relatively unresponsive sympathetically, as Maya showed by the frequency of skin resistance responses. Landis interpreted these results to mean that electrodermal responses were not an indicator of emotionality. Jones, 1935, who assumed electrodermal responses were closely tied to emotionality, proposed an alternative account for these data on the basis of the interpersonal discharge mechanism he articulated in 1930. Overt somatic responding attenuated autonomic responding. Landis's observations were based on between subjects rather than within subject comparisons, however, as were most of the developmental comparisons reported by Jones, 1935-1950. Contemporary studies of the relationship between expressive tendency and sympathetic activation in emotion have revealed a complex but relatively consistent pattern of results. Point 5 between subjects analyses have generally revealed a negative relationship between autonomic activity and facial expressiveness, e.g., Buck, 1977, Buck, Miller, and Call, 1974, Buck, Saban, Miller, and Call, 1972, Lanzetta and Klepp, 1970, Notarius and Levinson, 1979, Notarius et al., 1982, but see Zuckerman, Klorman, Larens, and Spiegel, 1981. For instance, Notarius and Levinson categorized subjects as high or low in expressiveness on the basis of their facial facial responses to a stress film. Subjects were then exposed to a threat of electric shock. Results revealed that subjects rated previously as being relatively low in expressiveness exhibited less facial expressiveness and greater autonomic activity than subjects rated previously as being relatively high in expressiveness. While these results are represented by the thumb times in the bottom panel of Figure 1, these data do not speak clearly to the operation of an emotional discharge process within subjects. Emotional discharge theory, therefore, points. 3. Buck, 1979, in discussing Jones's 1950 developmental model of emotional discharge, suggested that social punishment for overt expressions of emotion causes a child to suppress overt expressions of emotion. The suppressed overt expressions of emotion covariate with increased electrodermal responding, Buck suggested, at least in part because of the social disapproval. Buck's interesting suppression hypothesis does not imply that a trade-off between expressive and sympathetic reactions reflects some finite quantity of emotional energy being discharged through alternative, i.e., internalized or externalized, channels, i.e., an emotional discharge mechanism. For the notion of a trade-off between internal and external channels of expression of emotional energy should be distinguished from the notion of catharsis, which refers to the tension-reducing effects of some cognitive or behavioral activity that follows emotional stimulation. 5. Several features of experiments measuring both facial and sympathetic activity can render the information obtained about the relationship between expressiveness and sympathetic response of limited value in addressing the present question. These include the use of a limited range of emotionally evocative stimuli, e.g., only weak stimuli, and the use of pose rather than spontaneous facial expressions to examine expressive tendency in emotion. These experimental features, while perhaps informative about related theoretical questions, can yield weak to null relationships between expressiveness and sympathetic response because of a restriction of range in one or both dependent measures or because of unreliable estimates of an individual's natural tendency to respond expressively and sympathetically to emotional stimuli, e.g., see Cacioppo, Petty, and Tassinari, 1989. Studies employing stimuli or comparison conditions ranging from weakly to very evocative, therefore, provide clearer tests of the arousal and emotional discharge hypotheses and are of primary interest here. 114 Cacioppo et al. To an organization in the data that appeared from the perspective of arousal theories to be error variance, but is there evidence for the underlying interpersonal process as implied by Jones, 1930, Notarius et al., and others and depicted in the bottom panel of Figure 1? One source of evidence bearing on this question comes from within subject analyses, which have revealed weak to moderate positive correlations between sympathetic activation and facial expressiveness, e.g., Buck et al., 1974, Lanzetta, Cartwright-Smith, and Klepp, 1976, Zuckerman et al., 1981. These positive within-subject correlations have even been obtained in the same study in which a negative between-subject correlation between expressiveness and sympathetic response was found. See review by Buck, 1979-1980. Such results are consistent with predictions from emotional discharge theory if one assumes that these positive within-subject correlations are due to differences in the intensity of the emotional stimuli, see Fig. Year 1. A second source of evidence, the strongest against the awkward tie-in of an interpersonal emotional discharge process, comes from studies in which subjects amplified or inhibited their FA-style reactions to an emotional stimulus. As noted above, emotinal discharge theory predicts that the inhibition of expressive tendencies leads to a concomitant increase in sympathetic activation. This can be seen in the bottom panel of Figure 1, where inhibiting expressive tendencies moves one down along the energetic function that represents the total energy aroused by the emotional stimulus. Conversely, amplification of expressive tendencies is predicted to provide a ready output channel through which the emotional energy can be discharged and, hence, sympathetic activation should be attenuated. See Figure 1, bottom panel. Both predictions have consistently failed empirical tests. In an illustrated series of studies, Lanzetta et al. 1976 exposed subjects to painful electric shocks. Subjects were instructed either to conceal or to exaggerate their facial read times to the anticipation and delivery of each electric shock. The inhibition of expressive tendencies led to lower, not higher, skin conductance responses. Importantly, results from this series of studies further indicated that A. Instructions to inhibit expressive tendencies reduced expressive responses to the electric shock, and instructions to amplify expressive tendencies heightened expressive responses to the electric shock relative to free expression, i.e., baseline, conditions, and B. The inhibition of expressive tendencies again lowered skin conductance response, and the amplification of expressive tendencies heightened skin conductance responses relative to free expression conditions. In summary, empirical research suggests something of a coactivation, or co-inhibition, of sympathetic and expressive activation in emotion. As noted above, however, below was it. Subject correlations and the negative between subjects correla. Tie-ins between sympathetic activation and facial expressiveness do not fit well with the operation of the generalized arousal mechanism either. Thus, neither the arousal nor the emotional discharge formulation fares well in accounting for the relationship between facial expressiveness and sympathetic activation in emotion. The suppression and catharsis hypotheses warrant further research and may provide partial explanations. Neither, however, provides a comprehensive account of the intrapersonal processes underlying individual differences in expressiveness and sympathetic activation in emotion. In the next section, we consider a very basic mechanism that may consistently AC count for a portion of the variance in the almost certainly multiplied determined relationship between expressiveness and sympathetic activation in emotion. In this alternative formulation, our focus is explicitly on the dispositional mechanisms that might underlie expressive tendency and sympathetic activation. Point 6. Psychophysiological activation theory, themes on the excitatory response of the nervous system, patterns. In discussing general principles of behavior, Kimball, 1990, stated that up to a point, in obedience to Newton's second law, the greater the irritation, the greater the change, page 36. This fundamental principle of the excitatory response of the nervous system was central to the arousal and emotional discharge the areas reviewed above and serves as the basis for the first two postulates of our model of the mechanism underlying expressive tendencies and autonomic activation in emotion. A. Individuals are comprised of partially interacting neurophysiological systems, each with response potentialities that are stable until. Buck, 1979, also discussed several mechanisms that have been posited to account for these data. Eysenck, 1967, theory of intro-Rosham extroversion posits that individuals differ in their threshold of activation and, specifically, that the ascending reticular activating system has a lower threshold of activation in introverts than in extroverts. Hence, introverts are posited to show greater electrodermal activity, greater sensitivity to social disapproval, and hence greater inhibition of overt responding. Gray, 1972, offered revisions to this framework to emphasize susceptibility to punishment rather than conditioning, but the basic predictions regarding expressiveness and sympathetic activa tie-in in emotion remain the same. As illustrated in the next section, individuals heretofore labeled as generalizers are predicted to be a heterogeneous group, and individual differences within this diverse group may bear more on introversion and extroversion than on individ. UAL differences in response thresholds. Because situations and stimuli often have stronger effects on psychophysiological responding than do constitutional factors, Mertek, 1984, several potentially confounding sources of variance in this area of research might also be mentioned. First, situations involving the suppression of overt expressions may also be characterized by more intense emotional stimuli than situations in which free expression is socially acceptable, that is, a confounding between intensely evocative situations and environmental contingencies favoring the suppression of overt expressions may occur. Suppressing one's facial display when playing poker with a mediocre hand is hardly worth the effort, whereas suppressing one's facial display when holding a royal flush, an evocative stimulus, is important if one is to reap any rewards. In addition, the effort to suppress an overt expression could itself contribute to autonomic arousal, particularly if the suppression of overt expressions is not yet well learned. But 1976 also suggested that the suppression of emotional expressions may diminish the likelihood that the individual will receive material assistance or social support. When this occurs, stressors may have differential effects on internalized processes simply because individuals who were expressive received more aid in dealing with the stressor than those who were not expressive. Patterns 115. Ignited to action or inaction, and B. The greater the stimuli tie-in of an excitatory neural system, the greater the output from the system tends to be. See footnote 1. Research since the proposal of arousal and emotional discharge theories has also detailed several themes on I.E. various tie-ins in the excitatory response of the nervous system. One theme, regarding how excitatory input to the somatic and to the sympathetic nervous systems can lead to differentiated somatovisceral responses, emphasizes the patterns of excitatory input to effectors. Temporal and spatial patterning of excitatory input to and within the somatic and autonomic nervous systems, SPE-specific inhibitory actions of the parasympathetic nervous system, differential reactivity of alpha and beta adrenergic receptors within the autonomic nervous system to sympathetic postganglionic neurotransmitters and to circulating catecholamines, and feedback mechanisms that exert selective, inhibitory influence following stimulation, e.g., the baroreceptor mechanisms, and muscle spindles, contribute to this form of patterning. A second theme is that psychophysiological patterning derives from differences within and across individuals in the operating characteristics of physiological systems. Examples include differential response thresholds, onset delays, and time constants, recovery periods, of mediating systems, e.g., due to differences in receptor coupling and neurophysiological properties of axonal fibers, differential amplification or gain within and across individuals on the input, I.E., efferents, in producing the output, i.e., somatic or visceral response, nonlinearities between the input and output, e.g., the law of initial values, differing asymptotic levels, and set points across effectors, and differences in the system operating response curves that obtain when the input is increasing versus decreasing, i.e., hysteresis. The third theme is related to the second in that it represents the variance among somatovisceral responses that derive from an instability across time in one or more of the preceding system operating characteristics. These themes on the excitatory response of the nervous system have contributed to a shift in psychophysiology from the once dominant emphasis on general and diffuse physiological arousal to the study of somatovisceral patterns that emerge from what have traditionally been considered excitatory tasks and conditions, e.g., C. Berntsen, Cacioppo, and Quigley, 1991, Cacioppo and Tassinari, 1990 C. Coles, Jennings, and Stern, 1984, Fowles, 1980. Over and above the response variation that may arise from potentially differentiated patterns of activation, Figure 2 illustrates the variation that can manifest in 6 different physiological measures even when the output of each of these effectors conforms to the principle, the greater the irritation, the greater the change. These effectors show strikingly different end responses that are due in part to the confluence of excitatory and inhibitory influences and to variations in neuropsy. Logical properties of the response system. Thus, even a fairly simple, contemporary treatment of psychophysiological activa time yields a highly differentiated picture of physiological activa ions within and across individuals. From this psychophysiological perspective, we can derive a third postulate that is central to the present analysis. There are individual differences in the operating characteristics of neuroeffector systems. We begin by outlining the basis for this POS. Too late. We then illustrate how a derivative proposition that there are individual differences in the gain operating on inputs to the facial expressive and to the sympathetic response John Nell yields testable predictions about the behavior of the nervous system and of individuals, produces a simple account for the existing data on internalizers and externalizers, and results in new predictions regarding the group labeled generalizers. Neural systems characterized by their operating action characteristics. Sigmoidal activity functions are standard when modeling the innervation of a neuroeffector as activation of a general neural system increases, e.g., C. Berntsen et al. Parrott, 1991. Features of this sigmoidal activity function can be further parsed into operating characteristics such as threshold, gain, Rule of slope, dynamic range, linearity, asymptote, recovery function, and stability. Point 7. The threshold of a system refers to the point at which stimulus time is just strong enough to produce an output. The gain of a system refers to the increment of the response per quantum of stimulation, that is, the ratio of output to input. The thresholds of two neural systems could be similar, for instance, but could differ in gain if each additional quantum of stimulation x exceeds the critical firing threshold of more neurons in one than in the other system. The dynamic range of a system refers to the difference between the largest and smallest outputs across all possible levels of stimulation. The linearity of a system refers to the extent to which the ratio of output to input in the system, i.e., the gain, is constant across the dynamic range of the system. The law of initial values in psychophysiology, which states that the response to a stimulus is an inverse function of the pre-stimulus level of activation, is an example of a particular kind of system nonlinearity, specifically, one in which the gain on the system decreases as the pre-existing level of output increases. The asymptote of the system refers to the value of the maximum output. Recovery function refers to the rate and form of return of a system to its pre-stimulus functional state, follow ing stimulation. Finally, system stability refers to the reproducibility of the behavior of the system under similar conditions of stimulation. Several of these operating characteristics are depicted in Figure 3, and the relationship between these operating characteristics and psychophysiological responding is outlined. In Table 1, these operating characteristics refer to the output of a system, e.g., sympathetic nervous system or somatic nervous system, not to the cellular details by which this output is achieved. Point 8. 7. As noted above, subtle or stimulus-specific patterns of activation also exist within the sympathetic and somatic nervous systems. Facial expressions differ across emotions, for instance, because of an activa-tinal patterning within the somatic nervous system. Similarly, the pattern of sympathetic activation differs across the viscera in the orienting response. Within this global patterning, however, operating characteristics, e.g., gain functions, such as the one illustrated in Figure 3, continue to characterize the input-output relationships of the individual muscles or viscera. 8. Most somatic systems, e.g., facial nerve nucleus and 7th cranial motoneuron pool, are capable of complete relaxation and can lie dormant until ignited to action. 05. Skin conductance level. Low, moderate, high, extreme arousal. Finger pulse volume. Low, moderate, high, extreme arousal. F. 05. Forearm blood flow. Low, moderate, high, extreme arousal. Low, moderate, high arousal extreme. Heart rate electromyogram. Forearm extensors. Caret. Low, moderate, high, extreme arousal. Low, moderate, high, extreme arousal. Figure 2. Indicators of psychophysiological activation. Variation in the operating characteristics of physiological systems within an individual is the rule rather than the exception. From the Psychophysiology of Mental Illness by M. Later, 1975, London, Routledge and Kegan Paul. Copyright 1975 by Routledge and Kegan Paul. Reprinted by permission. Of particular interest here are individual differences in Sys10 gain. See Figure 3, bottom panel, which ceteris paribus manifests as effector reactivity. For purposes of illustration, consider two individuals who are exposed to a set of evocative emotional stimuli. Emotionality might be defined by the subjective reactions of the test subjects themselves, i.e., stimuli to which they render equivalent effective reports, alternatively, for e.g., autonomic systems are relatively stable about some set point under basal conditions and generally respond bidirectionally. Their activity is determined in part by neural, sympathetic or parasympathetic systems whose activity can, at least theoretically, range from zero to maximal input. See Bernsen, Cacioppo, and Quigley, 1991. The focus here is on the facial motor systems and the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. Thus, a sigmoidal function proxy makes the innervation to effectors observed as the activation of these neural systems increases. A larger test population, emotional stimuli could be standardized on the effective reports of an independent sample. Assume further that the stimuli are sufficiently evocative that both individuals display sympathetic and expressive reactions to them, i.e., the effects of the stimuli fall within the dynamic range of the system. If individual A displays stronger expressive 9 patterns allows one to focus on any number of system operating characteristics, e.g., threshold, gain, linearity, or recovery function. We focus here on gain for two reasons. First, gain is a straightforward system operating characteristic and, therefore, it is useful for didactic purposes to illustrate the heuristic power of patterns. Second, the psychophysiological manifestation of gain, reactivity, has been the focus of a large body of relevant research. Third, at least at the functional level, variations in system gain may provide insight into the mechanisms underlying individual differences in internagiod and externalized processes in emotion. Patterns 117. Times an individual B, and this expressivity is dispositional rather than an isolated or stimulus-specific event, e.g., the stimulus and the subjective experience evoked by the stimulus is equivalent for individuals A and B, then individual A could be said to have a relatively high gain on the somatic system underlying expressivity, at least as compared to individual B. On the other hand, if individual B shows a stronger sympathetic read time to the stimulus than individual A, and each can be characterized dispositionally by their sympathetic reactivity to the stimulation, then individual B could be said to have a relatively Table 1 relationship between system operating characteristics and attributes of psychophysiological activation. System operating characteristics psychophysiological manifestation. Threshold gain asymptote dynamic range linearity recovery function stability. Response sensitivity response reactivity maximal response individual response range law of initial value hysteresis half recovery time individual response consistency. Asymptote AO OO Low moderate HGH. Intensity of the emotion. O3. Intensity of the emotion. Figure 3. Selected system operating characteristics. Top panel, depict along the abscissa is the intensity of the emotion, i.e., the input to the neural system. Depicted along the ordinate is the functional output, e.g., in the sympathetic or somatic domain, as the intensity of the emotion increases. Bottom panel. Two sigmoidal activity functions characterized by different gains and asymptotes. High gain on sympathetic nervous reactions. These hypothesize how individual differences in physiological reactivity are depicted in Figure 4. Do such individual differences exist? Individual differences in physiological structure and function. An unmistakable and pervasive characteristic of our species is individual differences in physical features such as height, weight, eye color, hair color, skin pigmentation, and the like. Even brief encounters reveal a rich array of additional individual differences in psychological or behavioral attributes such as vocal pitch, sociability, temperament, intelligence, and emotional expressivity, e.g., Buck, 1976, Kagan, Resnick, and Smith-Mann, 1988, Plowman, 1989. On closer scrutiny, remarkable individual differences are also apparent in physiological structures, such as the size, shape, and specific location or orientation of such critical structures as the heart and brain, e.g., Bergman, Thompson, and Afifi, 1984, Gazzaniga, 1989. Importantly, reliable individual differences in physiological functioning, including somatic and sympathetic reactivity, have also been documented, e.g., Engel, 1960, Engel and Moos, 1967, Kasprowicz, Manek, Markov, and Kranz, 1990, Lacey. Bateman and Van Lane, 1953, Lacey and Lacey, 1958, Malmo. 1975. Point 10 Individual response stereotyping is a generic term which refers to variance in somatic and physiological activity that is attributable to the person or to person-situation interactions, e.g., reactivity measures, or distinctive physiological responses attributable to idiosyncratic appraisals or coping strategies, cf. Hare, 1973. Early observations by Lacey and his colleagues regarding dispositional contributions to physiological funk. 10 reactivity has been assessed in a variety of ways, including by raw scores, change scores, and residualized change scores. Change scores are problematic due to their elevated measurement error, low test-retest reliability, and spurious correlation with pre-stimulus scores, Cohen and Cohen, 1975, Kasprowicz, Manek, Markov, and Kranz, 1990. Hence, reactivity is often more clearly indexed by using a repeated measures, pre-stimulus or post-stimulus, analytic strategy, or by using post-stimulus responses to index reactivity after determining the pre-stimulus levels are comparable across subjects or conditions. By aggregating over measures, e.g., trials, tasks, or sessions, psychophysiology CAL assessments can also achieve acceptable psychometric properties. See Cacioppo and Tassinari, 1990 C. 118 Cacioppo et al. NMUC A_N in pound A. X. LU degree 2. Individual A. Individual B. I. 0A. A. Low moderate high intensity of the emotional stimulus. Individual B. Individual A. Low moderate high intensity of the emotional stimulus. Figure 4. Facial expressiveness as a function of the intensity of an emotional stimulus for two individuals, one whose somatic nervous system is characterized by low gain and one whose somatic nervous system is characterized by high gain, top panel, and sympathetic active cation as a function of the intensity of an emotional stimulus for two individuals, one whose sympathetic nervous system is characterized by low gain and one whose sympathetic nervous system is characterized by high gain, bottom panel. The dark lines in each panel depict the theoretical relationship between expressiveness and sympathetic active cation at 3 levels of stimulus intensity, and the ovals convey the variability typically found in psychophysiological functions. Tioni are illustrated in Figure 5. Briefly, each panel in Figure 5 reflects the systolic and diastolic blood pressure, skin conductance, heart rate variability, and pulse pressure responses of a single subject. Each line in a panel reflects physiological activity during rest or during one of 4 different tasks. Anticipation of cold pressure test, mental arithmetic, and word fluency. Physiological activity is depicted in terms of the subject's rank order among 42 subjects on each physiological measure when performing each of the tasks. Even a quick perusal of Figure 5 reveals 2 points. A. Striking consistency can be found within individuals in terms of their pattern of physiological responding across tests, depicted within each panel by the nearly overlapping lines, and B. Clear differences can be found within individuals in terms of which physiological systems show relatively high reactivity and which show relatively little reactivity across tests, depicted within each panel by the variations in rank across them. Physiological May assures. The concept of individual response stereotyping has been further differentiated since its introduction by Malmo and Chagas, 1949, and Lacey et al., 1953. Individual response hierarchy refers to individual differences in the response or responses, showing maximal, second most maximal, and least maximal activation across stressors. Malmo and Chagas, 1949, for instance, found that psychiatric patients who chronically complained of headaches showed relatively high reactivity to stressors in muscle tension in the forehead region, whereas psychiatric patients who chronically issued heart complaints, e.g., heart palpitations, showed relatively high reactivity in heart rate and heart rate variability. Lacey and Lacey, 1958, also observed individual differences in the stability of these response hierarchies, which led to the concept of individual response consistency. Individual response consistency refers to the reliability of these physiological response profiles across time. Inspection of Figure 5 reveals that the ordering of each individual's physiology cal responses is stable across several different stressors. Indeed, the response hierarchies depicted in Figure 5 represent remarkable, ably high individual response consistency. There is individual variability in this feature as well, with some individuals show ing little response consistency. See also Mertek, 1984. Finally, individual response uniqueness refers to differences across groups of individuals, e.g., hypertensives and normotensives, in response hierarchies. Hypertensives and offspring of hypertensives, for instance, are more likely to exhibit high cardiovascular reactivity than are normotensives and offspring of normotensives, e.g., Fredrickson et al., 1985. The ontogeny of individual differences in physiological functioning is less clear, but could flow from as simple a source as natural variation in a heterogeneous gene pool. Indeed, such variation should yield individual differences in the operating characteristics of physiological systems at multiple levels of organization. Moreover, the forces of natural selection potentiate a wide range of population distributions for these physiologically-based individual differences. Social and environmental forces also play an important role in shaping individual differences in physiological functioning and in translating these physiologically-based individual differences into personality and social behavior. Recent reviews, for instance, indicate that individual response consistency is higher when comparisons are made within rather than across stressors. Forster, 1985, Mertek, 1984. This is consistent with the notion that there are substantial situational and situation X patterns. 119. O. Legend, resting level mental arithmetic anticipation of cold pressor word fluency cold pressor. Code number 32W0 foot equals 0.90. SBP-DBP. Case number 46. PCHR variable VHRPP. W0 foot. Figure 5. For examples of individual response stereotyping, the 5 conditions of measurement are shown at the top of the figure. On the abscissa are shown the 6 variables measured. SBP equals systolic blood pressure, DBP equals diastolic blood pressure, PC equals skin conductance, HR equals heart rate, VHR equals heart rate variability, and PP equals pulse pressure. The ordinates represent ranks, showing the relative positions of the subjects in the total group of 42. From psychophysiological approaches to the evaluation of psychotherapeutic process and outcomes, page 189, by J. I. Lacey, in EPA, Rubenstein and M. B. Harloff, EDS, Psychophysiological Approaches to the Evaluation of Psychotherapeutic Process and Outcomes in Research and Psychotherapy, 1959, Washington, D.C., American Psychological Association. In the public domain. Disposition, determinants, as well as dispositional determinants of physiological response. Indeed, powerful situational determinants of physiological response have been identified, I count, situational response stereotypes. Importantly, these situational determinants coexist with, and are capable of overwhelming, individual response stereotypes, e.g., Fahrenberg, Forster, Schneider, Muller, and Mertek, 1986, Forster, 1985, Kagan et al., 1988. Just as can be the case when studying dispositional contributions to behavior, therefore, analyses of the dispositional contributions to somatovisceral response require that situational influences, e.g., learning histories and degree of spontaneity versus intentionality in expressive actions, and situational dispositional interactions also be considered. Finally, note that the existence of physiological dispositions to respond in characteristic ways does not imply that there are necessarily simple relationships between physiological and psychological variables or traits. Infants who are relatively expressive or sympathetically reactive at birth may also tend to ward being relatively expressive or sympathetically reactive as children and as adults, but it is the interaction of these physiological dispositions with environmental and social events that shapes both physiological and psychological dispositions at maturity. Although questions about the nature of these interact times are beyond the scope of this article, pursuing such case times becomes more worthwhile if one can demonstrate that a specific physiologically based analysis of individual differences contributes to the solution of an existing enigma and generates new and testable predictions about individual differences and social behavior. Internalizers, externalizers, and generalize. We have posited that A. Individuals are composed of partially interacting neurophysiological systems, each with response POS abilities that are stable until ignited to action or inaction. B. The greater the stimulation of an excitatory neural system, the 120 Cassiopo et al. Greater the output from the system tends to be, see footnote 1, and c. There are individual differences in the operating characteristics of these neurovector systems. The model of internalizers and externalizers derived from these postulates is based primarily on the corollary that there are dispositional differences in system gain, which, in turn, underlie response reactivity. Specifically, we propose that there are individual differences in a. the system gain governing the output of motor nerves, including those controlling expressiveness, i.e., somatic nervous system. B. The system gain govern ing sympathetic innervation, i.e., sympathetic nervous system, and c. the stability of these gain parameters. These proposed tie-ins lead to a division of individuals along the dimensions of emotional expressivity and sympathetic reactivity. An example of such a division is illustrated in Figure 6 for those individuals for whom A and B are stable and dispositional. As noted above, the distribution of the gain for a given physiological, e.g., sympathetic or expressive, system may be non-Gaussian. Indeed, in an early study of nursery school children, Wetzler, Krabs, and Freeman, 1930, noted that those who were characterized by the smallest sympathetic reactions, as assessed by skin resistance measures, tended to be rated by judges viewing their overt expressions and behavior as either unemotional, i.e., lower left cell of Figure 6, or highly emotional, i.e., upper left cell of Figure 6. Jones, 1935, further observed that children who were characterized by the largest sympathetic reactions tended to be rated as either exceptionally low in expressiveness, i.e., lower right cell of Figure 6, or exceptionally high in expressiveness, i.e., upper right cell of Figure 6. It is therefore conceivable that the distributions of individual differences in the gain characterizing the operation of the sympathetic nervous system and in the gain characterizing the somatic nervous system are nothing like a Gaussian distribution. Non-normal distributions are not particularly problematic when trying to classify individuals if, following previous research, E.G., C. Lacey and Lacey, 1958, individuals are classified along each dimension of figure. A zero count M3I, SI, OS, O0, externalizer, generalizer, generalizer, internalizer. Low-high gain on the sympathetic nervous system. Figure 6. Individual differences in system gain. 6 based on their relative, i.e., between subjects, ranking along the physiological dimension of interest, e.g., facial expressivity and sympathetic reactivity. Individuals who show a high degree of unreliability in their rankings across stimuli or sessions would not be classified in any of the cells depicted in Figure 6. Instead, these individuals would be regarded as labeled on one or both of the dispositional dimensions outlined in Figure 6. The lability of these individuals' response hierarchies may itself be a stable characteristic across time and situation. However, second-order consistencies in self-reported mood states have received scrutiny recently, with good results, e.g., Larson and Diener, 1987. Second-order consistencies in an individual's physiological lability to emotional stimuli, i.e., individuals who are consistently labeled in expressiveness reactions, those who are consistently labeled in sympathetic tie-ins, and those who are consistently labeled in both expressive and sympathetic reactions, suggest possible links not only to effective lability, but also to symptomatology and health. Although potentially quite interesting, discussion of the characteristics of these individuals is beyond the scope of this article, but see Telligent, 1988. 2 cells in Figure 6 are of special interest here. Recall that Jones, 1935, described externalizers as persons who exhibit large expressive reactions, but infrequent or small sympathetic discharges when exposed to emotional stimuli, whereas he described internalizers as persons who exhibit large sympathetic discharges, but little expressive activity when exposed to emotional stimuli. Those falling into the upper left cell of Figure 6 are characterized by relatively high gain on expressiveness and relatively low gain on sympathetic nervous reactions. That is, they are externalizers by Jones's definition. Individuals falling in the lower right cell of Figure 6, in contrast, are characterized by relatively low gain on expressiveness and relatively high gain on sympathetic nervous reactions. These individuals, therefore, meet Jones's definition of internalizers. The classification of individuals in Figure 6, however, is based on the simple characterization of physiological functioning in terms of individual differences in system gains. The mechanism outlined in this model may offer a simple account of data from within subjects and from between subjects analyses of expressive and sympathetic reactions to emotional stimuli. The empirical implications of classifying individuals in terms of system gains are depicted in the top panel of Figure 7. We illustrate the pattern of sympathetic and somatic tie-ins that would be expected by the operation of the gain mechanism in the case of a prototypic externalizer, individual A, and in the case of a prototypic internalizer, individual B. Predict reactions across 3 levels of emotional stimulation are considered. Not depicted in Figure 7 are the floor and ceiling. Effects that can result from presentations of very weak or intense emotional stimuli. This is because neither very weak, i.e., subthreshold, stimulation nor very intense, i.e., suprasymptotic, stimulation provides a means of discriminating individual differences in system gains, e.g., compare Figures 3 and 7. As before, the ovals in Figure 7 are meant to convey the considerable variability typically found in psychophysiological functions, e.g., due to stimulus-response stereotypies and habitual TKM processes. The dark line within each oval in Figure 7 repra. Patterns 121. Since the theoretical regression line derived from the operation of the proposed mechanism across the dynamic range of the expressive and sympathetic response systems, the positive regression slope for the internalizer and for the externalizer denotes that expressiveness and sympathetic activity are coactive based as emotional intensity increases. Thus, both individual A and individual B, representing a prototypical externalizer and a prototypical internalizer, respectively, exhibit increments in internal, e.g., sympathetic, and external, e.g., expressive, output to an increment in emotional input. Individual A, relative to individual B, also shows a large change in expressive output and a small change in sympathetic output as emotional input increases. At an operational level, these differences manifest as individual differences in physiological reactivity to stressors or strong emotional stimuli. See Table 1. With all else equal, there. 4. Individual differences in system gains would produce moderate positive within subject correlations between facial expressiveness and sympathetic activity. A particularly intriguing and perplexing result in research on internalizers and externalizers has been the negative between subjects correlation between facial expressiveness and sympathetic responses. Consider the results presented in an INVERTANT early study in this area, Buck et al., 1972. Buck and his colleagues examined the relationship between the accuracy of nonverbal communication, due at least in part to facial expressiveness, and skin conductance response. The mean responses for each subject were graphed by Buck et al. To emphasize the negative covariation between expressiveness and skin conductance response. This between subjects scatter plot is reproduced in Figure 8, where the negative between subjects correlation is indeed quite apparent. Figure 8 depicts a clear sex difference, but the pattern of data is similar within the set of male subjects and within the set of female subjects. Despite the fact that the theoretical mechanism underlying the response patterns depicted in Figure 7 leads to a coactivation of somatobisceral activity as the intensity of the emotional stimulus increases, the between subjects regression lines depicted in Figure 7, I.E., the between ovals lines, match the form of the negative covariation between expressiveness and sympathetic response reported in the literature, e.g., see Figure 8. Note, too, that even though Figure 8 does not display any within-subject data, the general location of the mean responses for internalizers and for externalizers are in accord with the theoretical expectations depicted in Figure 7. The model, therefore, accommodates both the positive within-subject and the negative between-subject correlations that have generally been reported. Of course, the mechanism underlying the predictions in Figure 7 is neither emotional discharge nor general arousal, but simple individual differences in system gains. Predictions for generalizers were not depicted in the top panel of Figure 7 for purposes of clarity. However, inspection of the bottom panel of Figure 7 reveals that the inclusion of generalizers does not change the within-subject or between-subject predictions that are derived from this model. Model. These correlations are moderate and would be diminished further in empiric health studies and in everyday life kits, as we have suggested. The psychophysiological mechanism we have modeled is only one of several determinants of an individual's sympathetic and expressive reactions. We return to this issue in the final section of this article. In addition to the positive mechanism accounting for much of the existing data on internalizers and externalizers, new predict times also emerge from this model. Consider the individuals falling in the lower left and upper right cells of Figure 6. Because these individuals show approximately equal increases in expressiveness and sympathetic activity, they can all be characterized as generalizers. Jones, 1950. Previous investigators have commented on the variability among subjects who they characterized as being generalizers, e.g., Jones, 1935. The present analysis indicates that these generalizers are, at least in theory, a heterogeneous group who can be partitioned into more homogeneous subgroups. Facial expressiveness and sympathetic reactivity for these individuals fall in about the same position within their response hierarchies, i.e., the relative gain. of these systems is approximately equal, but the response ranges and the absolute value of these gains differ dramatically across these groups of generalizers. Among these generalizers are those who are predicted to show relatively little expressive and sympathetic reactions to emotional stimuli, and those who are predicted to show relatively intense facial expressions and sympathetic responses to such stimuli. This, of course, is in complete accord with Wexler et al. S. 1930 and Jones's 1935 early observations regarding individual differences. Thus, somatovisceral reactivity is, by definition, higher in the general lizards depicted in the upper right cell of figure 6 than for the generalizers depicted in the lower left cell. The differences in gain on the expressive and sympathetic nervous systems constitute fundamental differences in the modes of somatovisceral output and presumably have implicit tie-ins for the organization of personality and social behavior. As Buck, 1976, suggested, individuals whose emotional reactions are observable by others, in contrast to individuals whose observable emotional reactions are muted or distorted, are in a better position to secure the material and social support necessary to cope with stressors. There are also several theoretical variations on the positive mechanisms that bear on personality processes and social behavior. One interesting variation is proved by set point models, which are based on the premise that 11. Although this prediction is consistent with the extant literature, several additional explanatory comments are warranted. First, recall that most studies have assessed skin conductance, which is governed by the sympathetic, but not the parasympathetic, nervous system. SEC on. The postulates of the present model are predicated on the emotionally activating stimulus being of sufficient intensity to exceed response thresholds for expressive and sympathetic activity. The system operating characteristics of response thresholds and recovery functions, and their interactions with system gain, are of theoretical interest but are beyond the scope of this article. Because the present model focuses exclusively on the implications of individual differences in system gain, predictions from the model apply only under restrictive, though explicit, conditions, e.g., the set of emotional stimuli must be neither subthreshold nor suprathreshold. Finally, analyses in prior research have tended to focus on those subjects in the original pool of subjects, whom authors identified as internalizers and externalizers. Hence, our initial focus here is on predictions regarding the expressive and sympathetic responses of internalizers and externalizers. 122 Cacioppo et al. Ino, I. To be pound O. XUJ.50. 2. Individual A, externalizer. Positive within subjects correlations. Individual B, internalizer. Negative between subjects correlations. Low, moderate, high. Sympathetic activation. 0, 10. O, XUJ. 200. I. Individual A, externalizer. Positive within subjects correlations. Negative between subjects correlations. Individual B, internalizer. Low, moderate, high. Sympathetic activation. Figure 7. Top panel. The relationship between facial expressiveness and sympathetic activation of a prototypical externalizer, individual A from figure 4, and a prototypical internalizer, individual B from figure 4, as a function of the intensity of an emotional stimulus. Predictions are predicated on individual differences in system gains. Predictions for generalizers are not depicted in this panel for purposes of patterns 123. There is an optimal level of physiological activation. These models differ from one another in terms of what constitutes a set point, what constitutes discrepancies from the set point, and what are the consequences of phasic and tonic discrepancies from the set point. In one such model, a motivational state exists to maintain a level of somatovisceral activity around some common, universal, set point during waking states. AC, according to this model, the generalizers in the lower left cell of figure 6 prefer and seek more arousing environments than the generalizers in the upper right cell of figure 6. This is because individuals in the lower left cell show relatively weak physiological reactions to excitatory stimuli and thus require more FRE-quent or intense stimulation to achieve the same intermediate level of somatovisceral activation as individuals in the upper right cell of figure 6. Therefore, the former group of genera lizards may act in a more extrovert, impulsive, or disinhibited fashion than the latter group of generalizers. This raises the possibility that the previous work on individual differences in sensation seeking, Zuckerman, 1979, introversion extraversion, Ising, 1967, strength of the nervous system, Sales, 1971, temperament, Kagan et al., 1988, and impulsivity, Stickman, 1990, may be relevant to research on the relationship between facial expressiveness and sympathetic activity because of the gain mechanisms underlying the physiology and behavior of generalizers rather than, for instance, the response modes, see Buck, 1979. Another version of the set point model yields a somewhat different prediction. The premise underlying the second model is that individuals are motivated to maintain their level of expressive and sympathetic activity around some proportion of their dynamic ranges. Individuals might be motivated to maintain a level of activation at, for instance, 33% of their maximal level of activation. This yields different but equally test-able predictions regarding the behavior of these individuals and their nervous systems. Specifically, the generalizers in the lower left cell of Figure 6 should prefer and seek equivalently arousing environments as the generalizers in the upper right cell of Figure 6. This is because the former group of generalizers should show not only dampened responses to emotional stimuli, but also lower asymptotic levels for the expressive and sympathetic reactions. Therefore, evocative surroundings would be expected to evoke smaller responses from the former group of generalizers, but these responses would constitute a proportionally larger share of the dynamic range of these individuals' expressive and sympathetic nervous systems. One need not assume a set point model, of course. One could alternatively focus on differences in response thresholds or recovery functions and their effects on personality processes and social behavior. Generalizers in the upper right cell of Figure 6, for example, might also be characterized by lower response thresholds than those depicted in the lower left cell. Unfortunately, there is a dearth of empirical research at present with which to examine these models. However, a recent study by Pievik, Stelmach, and Bijlsma, 1988, supports the notion that differences in the gain-on, rather than response threshold for, motor expressiveness contribute to individual differences in sensation seeking and in introversion-extroversion. Subjects completed the sensation seeking questionnaire, Zuckerman, 1979, and the ISANC personality questionnaire, ISANC and ISANC, 1975, and were tested for motor reflex response and motoneuronal excitability. Pievik et al. Found that these personal ATY groups did not differ in terms of the intensity of stimulation required to elicit a motor response, which suggests these personality groups have equivalent somatic thresholds. High extroversion and sensation-seeking individuals, however, displayed reduced motoneuronal excitability once motoneuronal activity was initiated than did their counterparts. Although preliminary, these data suggest that individuals in the lower left cell of Figure 6 may also be more likely to act in an extrovert or disinhibited fashion than individuals in the upper right cell of Figure 6. Basic and applied implications of patterns. We have suggested that all strong emotions result in some degree of activation of the organism, but that one situation, emotion, or individual can differ from another, not only in the degree of activation they ordinarily produce, but also in the operating characteristics, e.g., gating or gain, of the activation. We further outlined how different effectors, e.g., efferent glands, facial muscles, and the heart, can show strikingly different responses in emotion, which are due in part to the influence of higher levels of neuraxis, the confluence of excitatory and inhibitory impulses of the nervous system, and neurophysiological properties such as receptor coupling. An interesting implicit tie-in of this reasoning, implicit in Figure 3, is the following. To the extent that emotions have distinct effects on bodily responses, these differential effects can be obscured at very low, narrow, or high levels of emotional stimulation. This attenua tie-in of psychophysiological relationships in emotion is explicable in terms of the restriction of range problem that derives. Clarity. The dark lines in each panel depict the theoretical relationship between expressiveness and sympathetic activation at three levels of stimulus intensity, Si equals weak, S2 equals moderate, and S3 equals strong. The ovals convey the variability typically found in psychophysiological functions. Bottom panel. The relationship between facial expressiveness and sympathetic activation at three levels of stimulus intensity for a prototypical externalizer, individual A, a prototypical internalizer, individual B, a prototypical generalizer with low gain in the sympathetic and in the somatic nervous systems, individual C, and a prototypical generalizer with high gain in the sympathetic and in the somatic nervous systems, individual D. The theoretical predictions remain unchanged when all subjects are considered. Positive within subjects covariation is expected between sympathetic and expressive reactions, and negative between subjects. Covariation is expected between sympathetic and expressive reactions. 124 Cassiopo et al. U underscore X KT30 less than JZO. I. SOU. FT. Plus 80. Plus 70. Plus point 60. Plus point 80. W plus point 40 and plus 30. Figure 8. Relationship between communication accuracy and sender skin conductance, SC, response. From nonverbal communication of effect in humans by R. Buck, B.J. Savon, R. E. Miller, and W. F. Call 1972, Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, 23, page 368. Copyright 1972 by the American Psychological Association. Reprinted by permission. From subthreshold, narrow, or suprasymptotic levels of stimulation. Central to the present analysis, however, is the postulate that not only are there individual differences in gross anatomy and physiological structure, e.g., stomach size and spatial orientation of the heart, but there also are individual differences in physiological function, e.g., aggregate system operating characteristics. Individual differences have been a fundamental part of theories of emotion for over a century. Perhaps variations on the present model can provide a rudimentary account for some of these individual differences in emotion. From patterns, for instance, we derive the postulate that there are stable individual differences among at least a subset of the population in terms of the gain, I.E. underscore, amplification, that characterizes the operation of the somatic and the sympathetic nervous systems. This postulate then forms the basis for a mechanistic account of much of the existing literature on internalizers and externa. Lizards, A. Only a small subset of the population can be classified reliably as internalizers or as externalizers. B. Whether individuals are classified as internalizers or externalizers, both sympathetic and facial expressive responses intensify as the intensity of the emotional stimulus increases. C. Between subjects, AMLI SES indicate sympathetic and facial expressive responses to strong emotional stimuli are negatively correlated. And D. Individuals classified as generalizers exhibit somewhat variable responses, perhaps because they represent heterogeneous, but now specifiable, subsets of individuals. Individuals. Individual differences in internalizing and externalizing processes in emotion have been of interest in part because of the long-standing belief that the inhibition of emotions can have negative health consequences, e.g., Alexander, 1950, Pennebaker and Chu, 1985. Emotional discharge theory was attractive because it provided a theoretical framework with which to explain why an individual's natural expressive tendency might have a helpful effect. Inhibiting expressiveness increases stress on the internal organs of the body, whereas disinhibiting behavioral expressiveness attenuates sympathetic arousal, e.g., Jones, 1930. As noted, empirical research has not supported this within subject emotional discharge hypothesis, e.g., see reviews by Buck, 1976, Matsumoto, 1987. See also, Funkenstein, King, and Drolet, 1954. Patterns may provide a framework with which to examine when and why the inhibition of overt responses in emotion has negative health consequences. One obvious hypothesis from the present model is that individuals who are characterized by an especially high gain on the sympathetic nervous system and, consequently, who also tend to be characterized by high autonomic reactivity are particularly likely to suffer organ stress and impairment. In addition, if one conceptualizes emotions as uncompleted action tendencies that can be reactivated by repeated stimulation, e.g., reappearance of the stressor or rumination about it, then interventions that allow an individual to safely complete the action sequence may help resolve the emotion and, therefore, have positive health consequences. In contrast to emotional discharge theory, however, the amplification of expressive reactions is not predicted to have a compensatory effect on sympathetic activity in the emotion. An implication for therapeutic interventions is that modifying how an individual conceptualizes or phrases patterns 125. Stressors, i.e., coping strategies, should be more effective in controlling physiological reactivity than training the individual to be more behaviorally expressive. Prior research has failed to reveal straightforward relationships between physiological and psychological traits, e.g., see Mertek, 1984. We are nevertheless optimistic about the ability of a physiologically based approach to personality processes and individual differences to complement behavioral and cognitive approaches. Physiological responses are multiply-determined, as are psychological traits and dispositions, Cacioppo and Tassinari, 1998. Cognitive, developmental, E.G., learning histo-rise, motivational, and biological factors all exert strong, additional influences on physiological activity and psychological dispositions. For instance, people tend to be more expressive when with friends than when alone. Phobics show exaggerated reactions to phobic relevant stimuli, the degree of spontaneity versus intentionality in expressive actions may influence the frequency and intensity of displayed expressive actions, and expressive movements of salient facial features may create a stronger impression of expressivity, which may lead to different social contingencies, e.g., the furrowing of dark versus blonde brows. Each may represent an irrelevant determinant of expressivity when trying to assess, for instance, an individual's natural expressive tendency. Various forms of the suppression hypothesis may also prove correct. The multiplied determined nature of physiological and psychological variables is important because the covariation between a given pair of physiological and psychological variables can be dramatically attenuated by the operation of other determinants of the physiological or psychological variable. See Cacioppo and Tassinari, 1990b. The covariation is attenuated between two multiplied determined variables even if one, e.g., a physiological variable is a sufficient cause for the second, e.g., a dispositional variable. A weak to moderate correlation between a physiology variable and a psychological variable, therefore, does not imply that a physiologically based approach to personality processes and individual differences is incorrect or uninformative. Indeed, we suspect the fundamental mechanism outlined in this article is a weak determinant of expressive or sympathetic reactions to any specific stimulus. We also suspect, however, that individual differences in fundamental physiological variables, E.G., gender, height, or the gains characterizing the operation of the somatic and sympathetic nervous systems, have subtly influences on a wide range of personality processes. Furthermore, the sympathetic and expressive nervous systems were selected for examination here because of our interest in the mechanisms underlying the relationship between facial expressiveness and visceral arousal in emotion. We focused PRI merely on a single system operating characteristic, gain, because the postulate of individual differences in system gain was sufficient to generate the within subject and between subjects patterns of somatovisceral activation depicted in Figure 7. Individual differences in operating characteristics outlined in PAT terms, but not discussed in this article, e.g., threshold or linearity, can also attenuate the covariation between two physiological variables or between physiological and psychological variables. Consider, for example, the implications for the correlations depicted in Figure 7 if individual differences in threshold, linearity, or recovery function were introduced, AC according to patterns. There are individual differences in all system operating characteristics for all systems across all levels of organization. Point 12 given the myriad systems and system OPRAT ING characteristics that can be related to the behavioral domain. Patterns may provide a useful conceptual framework within which to examine a number of questions regarding the physiological substrates of personality processes, individual differences, and behavior. Research on anxiety and phobia are illustrative of some of these issues. On the basis of psychiatric interviews, Hamilton, 1959, rated anxiety patients on a host of specific anxiety SYMP tones. Statistical analysis defined two orthogonal factors. The first factor loaded heavily on bodily, primarily visceral, complaints, and the second factor loaded on such symptoms as tension, insomnia, and anxious mood. The experiment was later repeated by Buss, 1962, using a more diverse sample of psychiatric patients. Buss also found two primary factors, a first factor that again emphasized autonomic reactivity, and a second FAC tour that emphasized restlessness, worry, and muscle tension. Prompted by Buss's work, Benz and Epstein, 1965, analyzed manifest anxiety questionnaire items and found three factors. The first factor was autonomic arousal, similar to that found by Buss and Hamilton. The second factor emphasized striated muscle tension, again similar to previous investigators. See, also, ISAC, 1961. The third factor, a verbal complaint factor, was characterized as feelings of insecurity. Although the above research did not involve the direct analysis of physiological responses, it suggests that the engagement of striate muscle responses in anxiety is to some degree independent of autonomic reactivity. Indeed, Benz, 1967, noted the parallel between his first and second factors and the internalizers and externalizers of Jones, 1950. He also noted a relationship between the somatic tension items and reported feelings of hostility and the tendency for men to score higher than women on this factor. Finally, he reported that neurotic patients showed greater specificity in their factor loadings than normal controls, suggesting that this might be a path to the development of psychopathology. Recent psychophysiological studies, e.g., Cook, Melamed, Comfort, McNeil, and Lang, 1988, Lang, 1985, have found more direct evidence for differing patterns of somatovisceral organization in anxiety, which are related to specific anxiety diagnoses. Simple phobics show pronounced visceral arousal, heart rate, and skin conductance increases during imaginal recall of phobic memories. Despite equivalent reports of fear distress, autonomic mobilization is significantly reduced in social phobics and is even less in panic patients, agoraphobics. Furthermore, consistent with the hypothesis of a differential emphasis on somatic and visceral reactivity, the fear memories of panic patients include significantly more muscle tension symptoms than the other anxiety diagnoses. Cook et al., 1988. 12 by levels of organization, we mean the different scales into which the body can be represented. Cacioppo and Tassinari, 1990c. A particle law representation makes certain information explicit at the expense of other information and, hence, renders some operations or insights easy and others quite difficult. 126 Cacioppo et al. However, studies of anxiety patients also emphasize the task specificity of psychophysiological phenomena. The psychophysiological patterns are not invariant and may be dramatically different in another context of measurement. Thus, panic patients generate more, not less, skin conductance responses than simple phobics when subjects are at rest, and fear cues are not presented, e.g., later, 1975. Furthermore, system gain to strong input is less relevant in this context. A lower threshold of reaction to innocuous stimuli may be the more important parameter, reflecting a persistent set of hypervigilance and general anticipatory stress, a disposition not found in normals or simple phobics. In summary, high consistency of physiological pattern, regardless of the stimulus or context, is rare. Situational stereotypes are common and powerful. The past 2 decades of research on personality processes has demonstrated, however, that the influence of individual differences may coexist but be muted by situational influences, particularly when individuals' preference for one over another situation is ignored. From the present perspective, emotional responses are intrinsically multi-system events. To eliminate the meaning of a specific response, one must examine its covariation with other outputs and consider the context of evocation. The patterns approach may be useful because it is a logical way to organize empirical data. References: Alexander F., 1950. Psychosomatic